The water roared like a living beast as Grace Lawton stared at the swollen river cutting through the valley, her heart hammering against her ribs while rain pounded down on her shoulders and the distant screams of her younger sister echoed in her memory. Trapped on the other side with a rattlesnake bite that would kill her within hours if Grace did not reach the doctor in Watsonville, California, and bring him back before nightfall. It was April of 1882, and the spring rains had transformed the normally placid crossing into a churning torrent of muddy water that carried tree branches and debris downstream with terrifying force. Grace sat on her mare, Daisy, her hands trembling as she calculated the impossible distance. 20 feet across, maybe 30 in some places, with currents that could sweep a horse and rider away in seconds. But Emma was only 16 years old, and the venom was already spreading through her leg when Grace had left her with their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson. Every minute counted. She urged Daisy forward, and the horse whinnied in protest, dancing sideways at the water's edge. Grace knew it was madness, but what choice did she have? Their parents had died 2 winters ago from influenza, leaving Grace at 21 to care for her sister on their small ranch 15 miles south of town. There was no one else to make this journey, no one else to save Emma. The mare's front hooves touched the water and Grace felt the powerful current immediately pull at them. Her breath caught in her throat as fear coursed through her veins, but she pressed forward, whispering prayers under her breath. "Stop right there." A male voice shouted over the roar of the river. Grace twisted in her saddle to see a cowboy riding hard toward her on a large bay gelding, his hat pulled low against the rain. He was tall in the saddle with broad shoulders, and even from a distance she could see the urgency in his movements as he closed the gap between them. "Are you out of your mind?" he called as he drew closer. "That river will kill you. My sister is dying." Grace shouted back, her voice breaking with desperation. "I have to get to the doctor in Watsonville." The cowboy reached her position and pulled his horse to a stop. Up close, Grace could see he was perhaps 25 or 26, with dark hair plastered to his forehead from the rain and intense blue eyes that assessed the situation with the practiced gaze of someone accustomed to making quick decisions in dangerous circumstances. His jaw was strong and shadowed with stubble, and there was something solid and capable in the way he sat his horse. "How long does she have?" he demanded. "Hours at most. Rattlesnake bite. Please, I do not have time to argue." His eyes moved from her face to the raging river and back again. Grace saw the moment he made his decision, saw the set of his jaw and the determination that hardened his features. "You will never make it alone," he said firmly. "The current is too strong, but I have a better chance of getting across than you do." He swung down from his saddle with fluid grace and began stripping off his gun, belt, and boots. "I will swim across and bring back the doctor myself." "No." Grace dismounted as well, her skirts heavy with rain. "You do not understand. The doctor needs to know which medicines to bring, needs to know Emma's symptoms. I have to be the one to tell him." The cowboy stared at her for a long moment, water streaming down his face. Then he cursed under his breath and began untying his saddlebag. "Then we go together. But not on the horses. They will panic in that current and drown us both." He worked quickly, securing his belongings. "We swim. I will help you across." "I can make it on my own," Grace insisted, even as terror clutched at her heart. "Maybe you can," he said, meeting her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. "But maybe you cannot, and if you drown, your sister dies for certain. So swallow your pride and let me help you." The logic was irrefutable. Grace nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "Thank you." "My name is Grace Lawton." "Daniel Quinn," he replied, already moving to tie both horses to a sturdy oak tree well back from the riverbank. "Call me Daniel. When we get in that water, you stay close to me. If you start to go under, I will grab you. Do not fight me, understand? Let me do the work." Grace watched as he secured the animals with practiced efficiency. Daniel Quinn moved like a man who had spent his entire life working with horses and facing down danger. There was something reassuring in his confidence, even as fear continued to pulse through her veins. "I am a strong swimmer," she said, needing him to know she was not completely helpless. "Good. You will need to be." Daniel finished with the horses and turned to her. "Take off anything heavy. The weight will drag you down." Grace hesitated only a moment before removing her riding jacket and the heavy leather belt at her waist. Her dress would still be problematic, but there was no help for it. She could not very well strip down to her undergarments in front of a strange man, even if her life depended on it. Daniel seemed to understand her hesitation. "The dress will make it harder, but we will manage." He held out his hand to her. "Stay with me, Grace. No matter what happens in that water, you hold on to me if you need to. Promise me." She looked at his outstretched hand, strong and calloused from years of ranch work, and placed her own within it. "I promise." They approached the river's edge together. The water was even more intimidating up close, moving so fast that Grace could barely track individual currents. The sound was deafening, and the temperature when she tested it with 1 foot made her gasp. The spring runoff was ice cold, fed by snowmelt from the distant mountains. "The cold will be the second danger," Daniel said, keeping hold of her hand. "It will steal your strength fast. We need to move quickly once we are in. Aim for that outcropping of rocks on the far side. See them." Grace squinted through the rain and spotted the dark shapes jutting from the opposite bank about 20 yards downstream. "I see them. The current will carry us that direction anyway. Do not fight it. Swim at an angle, let the river do some of the work. Save your strength for when we need it." His hand tightened on hers. "Ready?" No, she wanted to say. No, she was not ready, would never be ready. But Emma was dying, and this man was willing to risk his life to help a complete stranger. Grace thought of her sister's face, pale and sweating with fever, and nodded. "Ready." They entered the water together, and Grace immediately felt the current seize her legs, trying to pull her downstream. The cold was shocking, driving the air from her lungs in a painful gasp. Daniel kept his grip on her hand as they waded deeper, and when the water reached her waist, Grace felt her feet lose contact with the bottom. For a terrifying moment she was flailing, her heavy skirts tangling around her legs and dragging her down. Water closed over her head and she panicked, swallowing river water that tasted of mud and spring rain. Then Daniel's arm was around her waist, hauling her up, and his voice was in her ear saying, "I have got you, just breathe." Grace gasped for air and found her swimming rhythm, kicking hard to keep her head above water. The current was impossibly strong, dragging them downstream faster than she had anticipated. Daniel swam beside her with powerful strokes, one arm still supporting her when the weight of her dress threatened to pull her under. "Keep going," he encouraged, his voice strained with effort. "You are doing fine." They were perhaps halfway across when a large branch came careening downstream directly toward them. Daniel saw it first and pushed Grace out of its path, taking the impact himself. She heard his grunt of pain as it struck his shoulder, saw him falter for a moment in the water. Without thinking, Grace grabbed his shirt and kicked hard, using every ounce of strength she possessed to keep them both afloat. "I have got you," she gasped, echoing his earlier words. Daniel recovered quickly, and they continued together, fighting the current that seemed determined to drag them under. Grace's arms burned with exhaustion, and the cold had seeped into her bones, making every movement feel sluggish and difficult. Just when she thought she could not go another foot, her hand struck rock. The outcropping Daniel had pointed out loomed before them, and he grabbed hold of it with one hand while keeping his other arm around Grace's waist. For a long moment, they simply clung there, gasping for breath and shaking with cold and exhaustion. Then Daniel was pulling them both along the rocks toward the shore, using them as handholds against the current. When Grace's feet finally touched the muddy bottom on the far side of the river, she nearly wept with relief. They stumbled out of the water together and collapsed on the bank, both of them coughing and shivering violently. The rain continued to pour down, but after the ice-cold river, it felt almost warm by comparison. "Are you all right?" Daniel asked between gasping breaths, his hand reaching out to touch her arm as if to assure himself she was real and whole. "Yes," Grace managed, though her teeth were chattering so hard she could barely speak. That branch hit you hard. I have had worse." He pushed himself to his feet and offered her his hand once more. "Can you walk? We need to get moving. Watsonville is still 5 miles from here." Grace let him pull her up, and for a moment she swayed on her feet, dizzy from exhaustion and cold. Daniel steadied her, his hands on her shoulders, his face close to hers. "You were incredibly brave in that river," he said quietly, and there was something in his eyes that made Grace's heart skip despite everything. "I have never seen a woman with that kind of courage." "I was terrified," she admitted. "Bravery is not the absence of fear. It is continuing on despite it." His hands lingered on her shoulders for another heartbeat before he stepped back. "Come on. Your sister is waiting." They began the long walk toward Watsonville, their clothes dripping and their shoes making squelching sounds with every step. The road was muddy and treacherous, but Grace pushed forward with grim determination. Now that they had crossed the river, she would not let anything else stop her from reaching the doctor. "Tell me about your sister," Daniel said as they walked. Grace suspected he was trying to keep her talking, to keep her focused on something other than her exhaustion and the cold that continued to seep into her bones. "Emma is 16, Grace said, picturing her sister's face. "She is smart and funny and entirely too adventurous for her own good. She was checking the fence line this morning when the snake struck. She killed it with a fence post, but not before it bit her twice on the calf." Daniel winced. 2 bites is serious. How long ago? 3 hours, maybe 4 by now. Grace felt tears prick at her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. "She was already feverish when I left. Mrs. Patterson is with her, but she is 80 years old and there is only so much she can do." "The doctor in Watsonville is good," Daniel said. "Doc Henry saved my brother's life last year after a horse kicked him in the chest. If anyone can help your sister, he can." Grace glanced at him. "You are from around here." "My family has a ranch about 10 miles north of Watsonville, the Quinn Spread. We run cattle mostly, some horses." He pushed a hand through his wet hair. "I was in town today getting supplies when the rain hit. I was heading home when I saw you about to ride into that river." "Thank God you did." Grace meant it with every fiber of her being. "I would have died in that water if you had not stopped me." "You might have made it," Daniel said, but his tone suggested he doubted it. "You are a fighter, Grace Lawton. That much is clear." They walked in silence for a time, the rain gradually lessening to a steady drizzle. Grace's dress clung to her uncomfortably, and her feet ached in her waterlogged boots, but she kept putting one foot in front of the other. Emma needed her. That was all that mattered. "How long have you been running your ranch alone?" Daniel asked after a while. 2 years, since our parents died." Grace heard the weariness in her own voice. "It is not much of a ranch, really, just 20 acres and a few head of cattle, but it is ours, and I am determined to keep it for Emma." "That is a lot of responsibility for someone your age." "I am 21, Grace said, a touch of defensiveness creeping into her tone. I am perfectly capable of managing a small ranch." "I did not mean to imply otherwise," Daniel said quickly. "I only meant that it cannot be easy. Running a ranch alone would challenge anyone, man or woman." Grace felt her defensiveness melt away. He had not meant it as an insult. "It is hard," she admitted. "There are days when I feel like I am drowning in work and worry, but Emma is counting on me. I cannot let her down." "You are a good sister," Daniel said softly. "She is lucky to have you." The outskirts of Watsonville finally came into view, and Grace felt a surge of relief so powerful it nearly brought her to her knees. They were almost there. Soon they would have the doctor, have the medicine Emma needed. Soon everything would be all right. Daniel seemed to sense her renewed urgency and picked up the pace. They half ran through the muddy streets of the town, ignoring the startled looks from townspeople sheltering on their porches from the rain. The doctor's office was on Main Street, a neat white building with a shingle hanging outside that read, "Henry Mitchell, Physician." Grace burst through the door without knocking, and a middle-aged man with graying hair and kind eyes looked up from where he had been organizing bottles in a cabinet. "Dr. Mitchell," Grace gasped. "Please, you have to help. My sister was bitten by a rattlesnake. She is dying." The doctor was already reaching for his bag, his movements quick and efficient. "When did this happen?" 4 hours ago, maybe more. 2 bites to her calf. She was already feverish when I left her." The words tumbled out of Grace in a rush. "She is at our ranch with Mrs. Patterson. Please, we have to hurry." "I will need to take my wagon," Doc Mitchell said, shouldering his bag. "The medicine and equipment I need are too heavy to carry on horseback." "Your wagon will never make it through the mud in this rain," Daniel interjected. "And there is the flooded river to consider. You cannot cross it by wagon." Doc Mitchell paused, his face troubled. "Then how are we to get the medicine to your sister?" Grace felt despair clawing at her throat. They had come so far, risked so much. There had to be a way. "What medicine does she need? What equipment? Perhaps we can carry it." The doctor considered this. "The most important thing is the antivenin. I have it here." He pulled out a small glass bottle filled with clear liquid. "Beyond that, I will need instruments for draining the wound, bandages, medicine for the fever." He began assembling items on his desk. "It is a lot to carry, but it might be possible." "We will make it possible," Daniel said firmly. "Pack everything in a waterproof bag if you have one. We will swim it back across the river." Doc Mitchell's eyes widened. "You swam across the flood, both of you." "It was the only way," Grace said. "And we will do it again if we must. But doctor, would you not be able to treat her better than we could? Is there no way for you to come with us?" The doctor looked torn. "I could try to ride around to the northern crossing. It is 20 miles out of the way, but the bridge there might still be passable. However, it would take hours, and you say your sister does not have hours." "She does not," Grace confirmed, her heart sinking. "We need to get the medicine to her as quickly as possible. Then I will prepare everything and give you detailed instructions," Doc Mitchell said decisively. He began moving around his office with practiced efficiency, gathering supplies and packing them into a canvas bag that he sealed with wax. As he worked, he explained everything to Grace in careful detail. How much antivenin to administer, how to drain the wounds properly, what signs to watch for. Grace listened intently, committing every word to memory. When he finished, he pressed the bag into her hands. "This is everything you need. Follow my instructions exactly. And Miss Lawton, I will attempt the northern crossing regardless. If I can make it through, I will come to your ranch to check on your sister." "Where exactly is your property?" Grace gave him directions, and Doc Mitchell nodded gravely. "I know the place. Your father bought it from old Sam Withers about 10 years back. Good land. I will do my best to reach you by tomorrow morning." "Thank you," Grace said, clutching the precious bag to her chest. Thank you so much." Daniel had already pulled out his wallet and was placing bills on the doctor's desk. "For your trouble and the medicine." Grace started to protest, but Daniel silenced her with a look. "We will discuss it later. Right now, we need to move." They left the doctor's office at a run. The rain had stopped entirely now, and pale sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds. Grace took it as a good omen as they retraced their steps through the town and back out onto the muddy road. The return journey seemed both faster and slower than the walk into town. Grace was acutely aware of the precious cargo in the waterproof bag, of the minutes ticking by while Emma grew weaker. But she was also exhausted, her body aching from the cold water and the long walk. More than once she stumbled, and each time Daniel was there to catch her, to steady her, to murmur encouragement. "We are almost there," he said as the roar of the flooded river came back into view. "Just one more crossing and then you can save your sister." Grace looked at the churning water with dread. She was not sure she had the strength to swim it again. But what choice did she have? She had not come this far to give up now. Daniel seemed to read her thoughts. "You can do this. I will be right beside you just like before." "The medicine," Grace said suddenly. "If the bag opens, if water gets in, it will not," Daniel said firmly. "Doc Mitchell sealed it well. But here." He took the bag from her and tied it securely to his belt. "I will carry it. That way you can focus entirely on swimming." Grace wanted to argue that it was her responsibility, but the relief she felt at having the burden removed was too great. "Thank you," she whispered. They reached the spot where they had left the horses, and Grace was relieved to see both animals still tied securely to the tree, looking wet and miserable but unharmed. Daniel checked them both quickly, then turned to Grace. "Same as before," he said, taking her hand. "We aim for the rocks. Let the current help us. Stay close to me." Grace nodded, gathering her courage. She looked into Daniel's blue eyes and found strength there, found determination that bolstered her own flagging resolve. "I am ready." The second crossing was even harder than the first. Grace's muscles were already exhausted, and the cold water sapped what little strength she had remaining. Twice she felt herself going under, felt the current pulling her down, and twice Daniel hauled her back up, his arm around her waist like an iron band. "Stay with me," he kept saying, his voice urgent. "Grace, stay with me." She fought with everything she had, kicking and pulling against the water that seemed determined to claim her. The rocks appeared ahead, and she reached for them with desperate fingers, catching hold just as a wave of dizziness swept over her. Daniel was there immediately, supporting her weight while she caught her breath. "Almost there," he said, and she could hear the strain in his voice. He was exhausted too, she realized. He had swum this river twice while partially supporting her weight, had been struck by debris, and had not complained once. What kind of man did that for a complete stranger? They dragged themselves out of the water and onto the muddy bank, and Grace collapsed immediately, coughing up water and shaking uncontrollably. Daniel knelt beside her, his hand on her back. "Breathe," he said. "Just breathe, you made it." Grace forced air into her lungs and pushed herself up onto her hands and knees. The medicine. They had to get the medicine to Emma. She looked at Daniel and saw him already checking the bag at his belt. He opened it carefully and pulled out the glass bottle of antivenin, holding it up to the watery sunlight. "Intact," he said, and the relief in his voice was palpable. "Everything is intact." Grace could have wept. Instead, she forced herself to her feet, swaying slightly. "We need to get to the horses. I need to get home to Emma." "Our clothes are soaked through," Daniel pointed out. "We need to wring them out as best we can or we will both catch pneumonia." He was right, of course. Grace quickly wrung out her skirts as best she could while Daniel did the same with his shirt. It did not help much, but at least they were no longer dripping. Then they were moving to the horses, and Daniel was untying them both. "Take my horse," he said, handing her the reins to his bay gelding. "He is stronger and faster than your mare. I will follow on Daisy." Grace wanted to argue, but she was too exhausted and too desperate to reach Emma. She mounted the gelding, settling the medicine bag carefully in her lap, and urged the horse into a gallop before Daniel had even mounted her mare. The ride to her ranch was a blur of pounding hooves and mud flying up from the road. The gelding was indeed fast, eating up the miles with powerful strides. Grace leaned low over his neck, one hand holding the reins and the other clutching the medicine bag like it was the most precious thing in the world. When her small ranch house finally came into view, Grace nearly sobbed with relief. She could see Mrs. Patterson standing on the porch, wringing her hands anxiously. The elderly woman's face lit up with hope when she spotted Grace riding hard up the drive. Grace dismounted before the horse had fully stopped and ran for the house, taking the porch steps 2 at a time. "How is she?" she demanded. Mrs. Patterson's face was grim. "Not good, child. The fever is high and she has been drifting in and out of consciousness. I have been doing what I can," but Grace did not wait to hear more. She burst through the door and into the small bedroom where Emma lay on the bed. Her sister looked tiny and pale against the sheets, her dark hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, and when Grace touched her hand it was burning hot. "Emma," Grace said urgently, opening the medicine bag with shaking fingers. "Emma, I am here. I have the medicine. You are going to be all right." Emma's eyes fluttered open briefly. "Grace!" Her voice was barely a whisper. "You made it. I made it." Grace fought back tears as she pulled out the bottle of antivenin and a syringe. Her hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped the bottle, and she forced herself to take a deep breath. She had to be steady. Emma's life depended on it. Footsteps sounded behind her, and Daniel appeared in the doorway, breathing hard from his ride. "What do you need me to do?" Grace had never been more grateful to see anyone in her life. "Hold her leg steady. I need to inject the antivenin." Daniel moved immediately to the bedside and gently but firmly held Emma's injured leg still. The snake bites were visible as 2 angry red puncture wounds surrounded by swollen, discolored flesh. Grace drew the antivenin into the syringe exactly as Doc Mitchell had shown her, her medical training from helping her mother through the years coming back to her now. "This is going to hurt," she warned her sister softly. Emma barely seemed to hear her, lost in the grip of fever. Grace said a silent prayer and administered the injection, her hands steady now that the moment was upon her. Emma flinched but did not cry out, too weak to do more than whimper. "Good," Daniel said quietly. "That was good, Grace. What next?" Grace consulted the mental list the doctor had given her. "I need to drain the wounds and apply the drawing salve, then bandage them and get the fever down." For the next hour, Grace worked over her sister with Daniel assisting her at every turn. He followed her instructions without question, his presence calm and reassuring in the small, stuffy room. Mrs. Patterson brought clean water and fresh linens, hovering anxiously in the doorway. Finally, with the wounds properly treated and bandaged and Emma dosed with fever medicine, there was nothing more to do but wait. Grace sat on the edge of the bed holding her sister's hand, exhaustion threatening to overwhelm her now that the immediate crisis had passed. "You should rest," Daniel said from where he stood by the window. "I will watch over her." Grace shook her head stubbornly. "I cannot leave her. I am not asking you to leave her, just to rest." Daniel crossed to the bed and gently but firmly guided Grace to a chair. "Sit here, close enough to touch her, but sit before you fall down." Grace sank into the chair gratefully, realizing her legs were shaking. She kept hold of Emma's hand, drawing comfort from the contact. Daniel pulled up another chair and sat beside her, and they settled in to wait together. Mrs. Patterson brought them blankets and hot coffee, tutting over their wet clothes and bedraggled appearance. "You both need to get out of those wet things before you catch your death," she scolded, but her eyes were warm with concern and gratitude. Grace wrapped herself in the blanket but refused to leave Emma's side long enough to change. Daniel accepted his blanket with thanks and settled back in his chair, his presence solid and comforting. As the sun began to set outside the window, Emma's breathing gradually became less labored. The fever was still high, but it seemed to have stopped climbing. Grace watched her sister's face anxiously, looking for any sign of improvement or deterioration. "She is fighting," Daniel said quietly. "I can see it. She is strong like her sister." Grace managed a small smile. "She is stronger than I am in many ways. Braver. More willing to take risks. I find that hard to believe, considering you were willing to ride into a flooded river alone." Daniel's voice was gentle, and when Grace looked at him, she found him watching her with an expression that made her heart skip. "You are one of the bravest people I have ever met, Grace Lawton." "I was terrified," Grace admitted, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "I am still terrified. What if the medicine does not work? What if we were too late? Then you will deal with it. But I do not think you were too late. Look." Daniel pointed to Emma's face. "The flush is fading a little, the fever is breaking." Grace looked at her sister with desperate hope and realized he was right. Emma's cheeks were not quite as flushed as they had been an hour ago, and her breathing seemed deeper, more regular. As they watched, Emma stirred and her eyes opened slightly. "Grace," she murmured, her voice hoarse but clearer than before. "I am here," Grace said, squeezing her sister's hand. "How do you feel?" "Terrible," Emma admitted, but there was a ghost of her usual humor in the word. "But alive, I think. Did you get the doctor?" "I got the medicine from the doctor," Grace said, brushing her sister's hair back from her forehead. "And I had help. This is Daniel Quinn. He saved my life today." Emma's gaze shifted to Daniel, and even in her weakened state, Grace could see her sister assessing him with interest. "Thank you," Emma whispered, "for helping Grace, for helping both of us." "It was my honor," Daniel said simply. Over the next several hours, Emma continued to improve steadily. The fever broke completely around midnight, leaving her weak and exhausted but clearly on the mend. Grace finally allowed herself to believe that her sister would survive. And the relief was so overwhelming she had to excuse herself to the porch where she stood in the cool night air and let the tears come. She did not realize Daniel had followed her until his hand touched her shoulder gently. "She is going to be all right. I know." Grace wiped at her eyes, embarrassed to be crying in front of him. "I am sorry, it is just the relief. You do not need to apologize." Daniel turned her gently to face him, his hands resting on her shoulders. In the moonlight, his face was all planes and shadows, his eyes dark and intense. "You saved your sister's life today, Grace. You were willing to die to save her. That is not something to apologize for." Grace looked up at him, this man who had risked everything for a stranger, and felt something shift in her chest. "You saved both our lives. I do not know how to thank you." "You do not need to thank me," Daniel said softly. His hands were still on her shoulders, warm and solid. "I only did what any decent person would do." "No," Grace said firmly. "Most people would have let me ride into that river alone. You did not have to help me. You did not have to swim that river twice, did not have to walk 5 miles in wet clothes, did not have to stay here helping me care for Emma. You could have left at any point, but you stayed." "Why?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, and Grace saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "When I saw you at that river," he said slowly, Saw the determination on your face and the fear you were trying so hard to hide. Something in me could not walk away. And then when we were in the water together, when you grabbed me after that branch hit and helped keep me afloat, I realized you were someone special, someone worth knowing. So I stayed because I wanted to, because I could not imagine leaving you to face this alone. Grace felt her heart racing. She was acutely aware of how close they were standing, of the warmth of his hands on her shoulders, of the way he was looking at her like she was something precious and rare. "I am glad you stayed," she whispered. "So am I," Daniel said, and his hands slid from her shoulders down to capture both of hers. "Grace, I know this is not the time or place, and I know we barely know each other, but I would like to see you again. Would like to get to know you better, if you are willing." Grace thought about all the reasons she should say no. She had a ranch to run, a sister to care for, a life that left little room for courting or romance. But when she looked into Daniel's eyes, all those practical considerations seemed distant and unimportant. "I would like that too," she said. Daniel's face broke into a smile that transformed his whole appearance, making him look younger and less careworn. "Good. That is very good." He squeezed her hands gently. "But right now, you need to rest. You have been running on fear and determination for hours, and you are about to collapse." Grace wanted to argue, but a wave of exhaustion swept over her as if summoned by his words. She swayed slightly, and Daniel caught her immediately, his arm around her waist. "Easy," he said. "Let me help you inside. You can sleep in your own bed. I will keep watch over Emma." "You need rest too," Grace protested weakly. "I will rest. But one of us should stay awake in case Emma needs anything. Let me do this, Grace. You have done enough for one day." Grace was too tired to argue anymore. She let Daniel guide her into the house and to her small bedroom. Mrs. Patterson had already laid out a clean, dry nightgown, and Grace changed quickly before falling into bed. The last thing she remembered before sleep claimed her was Daniel's voice saying softly, "Sleep well, Grace. I will keep you both safe." When Grace woke, sunlight was streaming through her window and she could hear the sound of voices coming from the kitchen. For a moment she was disoriented, wondering why she ached all over and why her throat felt raw. Then memory came flooding back, the river, Daniel, Emma's snakebite. She threw off the covers and hurried into Emma's room, her heart in her throat. But her sister was sitting up in bed, pale and weak but unmistakably alive and alert. Doc Mitchell sat beside the bed examining the bandages on Emma's leg, and Daniel stood by the window looking like he had not slept at all. "Grace." Emma's face lit up when she saw her sister. "Doc Mitchell says I am going to be fine. You saved my life." Grace crossed to the bed and hugged Emma carefully, mindful of her injuries. "How do you feel?" "Like I was trampled by a horse and then dragged behind it for a mile," Emma admitted. "But alive, which is more than I had any right to expect." "Doc Mitchell says if you had taken any longer getting the antivenin to me, I would not have made it." Grace felt tears prick at her eyes again and blinked them back. Doc Mitchell looked up from his examination with an approving nod. "Your sister did excellent work with the wounds and the medicine. You could not have done better if I had been here myself. And Mr. Quinn here tells me you both swam that flooded river twice to get the medicine. That is the bravest thing I have ever heard." "It was the only way," Grace said, glancing at Daniel. He was watching her with that same intense expression from the night before, and she felt warmth spread through her chest. "Well, you are both lucky to be alive," Doc Mitchell said, packing up his bag. "Miss Emma here needs rest and good food for the next few weeks while she recovers. No putting weight on that leg for at least 10 days. The wounds are healing well, but snake venom does serious damage to the body. She will be weak for a while." "I will make sure she rests," Grace promised. Doc Mitchell turned to her with a stern expression. "And you need to rest as well. From what Mr. Quinn tells me, you have been through quite an ordeal yourself. I want you taking it easy for the next few days. Let your neighbor help out around the ranch." Grace started to protest that she had too much work to do, but Daniel interjected smoothly. "I will stay and help out for a few days. My brothers can manage the ranch without me for a while." "You have already done so much," Grace objected. "I cannot ask you to. You are not asking. I am offering." Daniel's tone left no room for argument. "You need help, and I am here to provide it." "It is settled." Doc Mitchell smiled knowingly as he looked between Grace and Daniel. "Well then, I will check back in a few days to see how Miss Emma is healing. In the meantime, follow my instructions and she should make a full recovery." He tipped his hat to them both. "Good day to you all." After the doctor left, Mrs. Patterson bustled in with breakfast for everyone. Grace realized she was ravenous and ate everything put in front of her while Emma picked at her food with gradually returning appetite. Daniel sat with them at the table, and Grace found herself acutely aware of his presence, of the way his eyes kept finding hers across the table. Over the next few days, a routine developed. Daniel proved to be an enormous help around the ranch, mending fences and tending to the cattle with the ease of someone who had been doing such work his whole life. Grace found herself working alongside him, and they fell into an easy partnership that felt natural and comfortable. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch together after Emma had gone to sleep, talking about everything and nothing. Grace learned that Daniel was the middle of 3 brothers, that he had been born and raised in California, that he loved the ranch life, but sometimes dreamed of seeing more of the world. Daniel learned about Grace's parents and their deaths, about the struggles of keeping the ranch going, about her dreams for Emma's future. "I want her to have choices," Grace said one evening as they watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "I want her to be able to go to school if she wants, to marry for love if she chooses, to have opportunities I never had." "You are a good sister," Daniel said, his voice warm. "But what about your dreams? What do you want, Grace?" Grace was quiet for a long moment, considering. What did she want? For so long her life had been about survival, about keeping Emma safe and the ranch running. She had not let herself think about her own wants and dreams in years. "I want a partner," she said finally, the words surprising her even as she spoke them. "Someone to share the burdens and the joys with. Someone who sees me as an equal, not as someone to be protected or managed. I want what my parents had, a true partnership built on respect and love." Daniel reached over and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "You deserve that," he said softly. "You deserve someone who appreciates your strength and your courage, someone who will stand beside you, not in front of you." Grace looked at their joined hands, at the way they fit together so perfectly. "Is that what you want too?" "It is exactly what I want," Daniel said, meeting her eyes. "And Grace, I think I have found it with you." Grace's breath caught. They had known each other less than a week, and yet it felt like so much longer. She felt like she had known Daniel Quinn her entire life, like he was someone she had been waiting for without realizing it. "This is happening very fast," she said, voicing the thought that had been nagging at her. "Sometimes the best things happen fast," Daniel replied. "I knew the moment I saw you at that river that you were someone special, and every moment since then has only confirmed it." "I am falling in love with you, Grace Lawton. I think I started falling the moment you grabbed my shirt in that river and refused to let me go under." Grace felt tears prick at her eyes, but these were happy tears. "I am falling in love with you too," she admitted. "I tried not to. I told myself it was too soon, too fast, too complicated, but I cannot help it. You have become essential to me in such a short time." Daniel stood and pulled her to her feet, his hands framing her face gently. "Then let us not fight it. Let us see where this goes together. Grace nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Daniel leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, but Grace did not want to pull away. When his lips met hers, it felt like coming home. The kiss was gentle and sweet and full of promise, and when they finally broke apart, Grace was smiling so widely her cheeks hurt. "Stay," she whispered. "Not just for a few more days, stay for good. Help me run this ranch, be my partner." Daniel's eyes widened. "Grace, are you sure?" "That is a big decision." "I am sure," Grace said firmly. "I have never been more sure of anything. I know it is fast, but sometimes you just know. And I know that I want you here by my side for whatever comes next." Daniel kissed her again, longer and deeper this time, and Grace felt joy bubble up inside her like champagne. When they finally broke apart, Daniel was grinning like a fool. "Yes," he said simply. "Yes to all of it. I will stay. I will be your partner. I will spend the rest of my life standing beside you." The next few weeks were a flurry of activity. Daniel returned to his family's ranch to explain the situation to his brothers and collect his belongings. Grace had worried about how his family would react to his sudden decision to move in with a woman he barely knew, but Daniel returned with nothing but good news. "My brothers are happy for me," he reported, pulling Grace into his arms. "They have been trying to get me to settle down for years. And they want to meet you. I told them about your courage and your strength, and they are impressed." Emma recovered steadily under Grace's watchful care. The young woman had endless questions about Daniel and was clearly delighted at the developing romance between her sister and the cowboy who had helped save her life. "I knew it," Emma said smugly one afternoon as she sat on the porch watching Grace and Daniel work together to repair the barn roof. "I knew from the moment I opened my eyes and saw the way he looked at you. He was completely smitten." Grace laughed, feeling lighter and happier than she had in years. "Was it that obvious?" "Completely," Emma confirmed. "And you look at him the same way." It is disgusting and adorable at the same time. As summer deepened into fall, Daniel became an integral part of life on the ranch. He and Grace worked side by side every day, and their partnership grew stronger with each passing week. They complemented each other perfectly. Where Grace was cautious and practical, Daniel was bold and optimistic. Where Daniel sometimes rushed into decisions, Grace provided thoughtful consideration. Together, they made the small ranch more productive than it had been in years. In September, Daniel asked Grace to marry him properly. He did it at sunset on the porch where they had shared so many conversations, getting down on one knee and presenting her with a simple gold band that had belonged to his grandmother. "I know we have not known each other long," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. You are my partner, my best friend, my everything. Grace Lawton, will you marry me?" Grace did not hesitate. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They were married in October in a simple ceremony in Watsonville with Emma and Daniel's brothers in attendance. Doc Mitchell gave Grace away since she had no male relatives, and Mrs. Patterson cried happy tears throughout the entire service. Grace wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her, and carried wildflowers that Emma had picked that morning. As she stood beside Daniel and spoke her vows, Grace thought about the flooded river that had brought them together. She thought about how close she had come to dying that day, how fear had nearly stopped her from taking the risks necessary to save Emma. But she had found the courage, and in doing so, she had found so much more than she ever expected. Daniel's hand was warm and solid in hers as they exchanged rings, and when he kissed her as her husband for the first time, Grace felt complete in a way she never had before. This was what she had been waiting for, this partnership, this love, this man who saw her for exactly who she was and loved her for it. The years that followed were not always easy. Ranch life was hard, and there were challenges and setbacks along the way. But Grace and Daniel faced everything together, and their love only deepened with time. Emma recovered completely from the snakebite and went on to attend a teaching college in Sacramento, returning home during summers to help on the ranch. She eventually married a kind schoolteacher and settled in Watsonville, giving Grace and Daniel nieces and nephews to spoil. Grace and Daniel expanded the ranch slowly over the years, buying adjoining property when it became available and building up their herd. They became known throughout the region as fair employers and skilled ranchers, and their partnership was held up as an example of how a marriage should work. 2 years after their wedding, Grace gave birth to their first child, a boy they named David after Daniel's father. The birth was difficult, and for a few terrifying hours, Daniel feared he would lose Grace. But she fought through, as she had fought through everything else in her life, and emerged exhausted but triumphant with their son in her arms. "He looks like you," Grace said softly, tracing the baby's features with one finger. "He has your stubbornness," Daniel replied, his voice choked with emotion. "I could already tell when he was refusing to come out into the world." Grace laughed weakly. "That is my boy." David was followed 2 years later by a daughter they named Rose, and then 2 years after that by twin boys they named Marcus and Matthew. The ranch house that had once felt empty with just Grace and Emma now rang with the sounds of children playing and laughing. Grace proved to be a natural mother, patient and loving but firm when necessary. Daniel was equally devoted to their children, teaching them to ride as soon as they could walk and instilling in them the values of hard work and integrity. The children grew up knowing they were loved beyond measure, and that their parents' love for each other was the foundation of their family. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Daniel surprised Grace with a trip back to the spot where they had first crossed the flooded river together. The river was peaceful now, flowing gently in its banks under the autumn sun. They stood on the bank hand in hand, remembering that terrifying day and everything it had led to. "I would do it all again," Grace said softly. "Every frightening moment, every risk, every hardship, it brought me to you." Daniel pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "I was just thinking the same thing. That was the day my life really began, the day I met you." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the river flow past. Grace thought about how much had changed since that day 10 years ago, when she had been a desperate young woman willing to die to save her sister. She was still that same woman in many ways, still willing to fight for the people she loved. But now she had so much more to fight for, so much more to live for. "Thank you," she said suddenly, looking up at Daniel. "For what?" "For seeing me," Grace said simply. "For not trying to stop me from taking risks or making decisions. For treating me as an equal partner from the very beginning. For loving me exactly as I am." Daniel's eyes were suspiciously bright as he cupped her face in his hands. "You make it easy to love you. You are the strongest, bravest, most amazing woman I have ever known, and I fall more in love with you every single day." They kissed there by the river, and it felt like a renewal of their vows, a recommitment to the life they had built together. When they finally broke apart, they were both smiling. As the years continued to pass, Grace and Daniel grew old together, their love deepening into something rich and comfortable and enduring. They faced good times and bad times, successes and failures, but they faced everything together. Their children grew up and had children of their own, and the ranch that Grace had fought so hard to keep became a legacy for future generations. Emma remained close to her sister throughout her life, often joking that she owed her entire existence to Grace's bravery and Daniel's kindness. She never let them forget that their love story had begun with her snakebite. and she took great pride in telling the tale to anyone who would listen. On their 50th wedding anniversary, surrounded by children and grandchildren, Grace and Daniel renewed their vows once more. Grace was 71 years old now, her dark hair threaded with silver, but her eyes were as bright and determined as they had been the day Daniel first saw her at the river. Daniel was 75, his shoulders still broad but his hands gnarled with arthritis from decades of ranch work. As they stood together and repeated the words they had first spoken 50 years before, there was not a dry eye in the room. Their love was legendary in the family, a testament to what two people could build together when they had courage, commitment, and mutual respect. "I would cross that river again tomorrow," Daniel said during his speech at the anniversary celebration. "Every day, for the rest of my life, if it meant having Grace by my side. She is my partner, my love, my everything. And I am the luckiest man alive to have had 50 years with her." Grace squeezed his hand tightly, too moved to speak. Later, when they were alone in the house that had been their home for 5 decades, she finally found the words. "You saved my life that day at the river," she said softly. "But you did more than that. You gave me a life worth living. You gave me partnership and love and a family. You gave me everything I ever dreamed of and so much more. I love you, Daniel Quinn. I have loved you from the moment you refused to let me cross that river alone, and I will love you until my last breath." Daniel pulled her close, and they held each other in the darkness. Two souls who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful together. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and somewhere in the distance, a river flowed peacefully toward the sea. Grace closed her eyes and listened to the steady beat of Daniel's heart, and she smiled. This was home. This was love. This was everything she had ever wanted and more than she had ever dared to hope for. And it had all begun with a flooded river, a desperate ride, and a cowboy brave enough to swim beside her. They had 3 more years together before Daniel passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78. Grace held his hand as he took his last breath, whispering words of love and promising to see him again someday. She mourned him deeply, feeling the loss of her partner like a physical wound, but she also felt gratitude for the incredible life they had shared. Grace lived another 5 years after Daniel's death, surrounded by the family they had built together. She spent her final years telling stories to her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, stories about the old days, about running a ranch, about love and courage and never giving up. But her favorite story, the one she never tired of telling, was about the day she tried to cross a flooded river alone and a cowboy tied their horses and swam beside her. "That was the day I found my soulmate," she would say, her eyes distant with memory. "The day I learned that true love means having a partner who will dive into dangerous waters without hesitation, just to make sure you do not face them alone." When Grace passed away at the age of 86, she was buried beside Daniel on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built together. Their children and grandchildren gathered to say goodbye, and as the sun set over the California landscape, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, everyone agreed that Grace and Daniel had lived a love story for the ages. The ranch continued to thrive under the management of their descendants, and the story of Grace and Daniel became family legend, passed down through the generations. Every child in the family grew up knowing about the flooded river, the brave woman willing to risk everything to save her sister, and the cowboy who chose to swim beside her. It became a symbol of what the family stood for: courage in the face of danger, selflessness in service to others, and the power of love to transform lives. Years later, one of their great-granddaughters, a young woman studying history at university, wrote a thesis about the role of women in settling the West. She interviewed elderly relatives and researched old documents, piecing together the full story of Grace Lawton and Daniel Quinn. What she found amazed her. Not just a love story, but a testament to the strength and determination of frontier women, and the men who were wise enough to see them as equals. The thesis won awards and was eventually expanded into a book that brought the story of Grace and Daniel to a wider audience. Readers across the country were moved by the tale of the woman who braved a flooded river for love of her sister, and the man who dove in to help a stranger. The book sparked conversations about partnership, equality, and the true meaning of courage. But for the family, Grace and Daniel were never just historical figures or symbols. They were real people who had lived and loved and built something lasting. They were the foundation upon which multiple generations had been built, and their love remained a guiding light for all who came after them. On the ranch that had been Grace's home for more than 60 years, a monument was erected near the barn. It showed two figures, a man and a woman, standing side by side with their hands joined. The plaque at the base reads simply, "Grace Lawton Quinn and Daniel Marcus Quinn, partners in all things." Their love was the bridge that spanned any flood. Every year on the anniversary of that fateful river crossing, family members would gather at the monument to remember and give thanks. They would tell the story once more, making sure the youngest members of the family understood their heritage. And always, someone would raise a toast. To Grace and Daniel, who taught us that true love means swimming beside each other through any storm. The story of Grace and Daniel lived on, inspiring each new generation to face their own flooded rivers with courage, to find partners who would swim beside them, and to build lives based on equality, respect, and enduring love. It was a legacy that transcended time, a reminder that the greatest love stories are not about one person rescuing another, but about two people choosing to face danger together, as equals and partners. And somewhere, in whatever place souls go when bodies fail, Grace and Daniel were together still, hands joined, hearts united, ready to cross whatever rivers lay ahead side by side, just as they always had. Their love had been tested by flood and fire, by hardship and loss, and it had emerged stronger for every trial. It was a love that had built a family, sustained a ranch, and left a legacy that would endure for generations. That was the real miracle of that April day in 1882, when a desperate woman faced an impossible river, and a stranger chose to help her. Not just that they survived, though that was remarkable enough, but that they found in each other exactly what they needed, exactly when they needed it. They found partnership and respect, and a love that would last beyond their lifetimes, touching countless lives and inspiring countless others to be brave, to be kind, and to never face the dangerous rivers of life alone when there might be someone willing to swim beside them. The flooded river had been a crucible that tested them both and forged them into something stronger together than they ever could have been apart. And in the end, that was the greatest lesson of their story, that true love is not about grand gestures or fairy tale perfection. It is about showing up when things are hard, about choosing each other every day, about being willing to dive into cold, dangerous waters because someone you care about needs you there. Grace and Daniel had shown that to their children, who passed it to their children, who passed it to theirs. The love that began in a flooded river flowed on through the generations, an unbroken current of commitment, courage, and enduring devotion. And that, more than any material legacy, was the greatest gift they left behind. The knowledge that true love can weather any storm, cross any river, and last forever when two people are willing to stand together no matter what comes. Their story had no sad ending, no tragedy to mar the beauty of what they built. They had lived long, full lives surrounded by love and family. They had faced challenges and overcome them together. They had raised children who knew they were loved and built a legacy that honored both of them equally. And when death finally came, it found them ready, content in the knowledge that they had lived well and loved deeply. In the end, that was all anyone could ask for: a life well lived, a love fully given and received, and a legacy that would inspire others long after they were gone. Grace and Daniel had all of that and more. Their love story, which began with a flooded river and a cowboy's courageous decision to tie their horses and swim beside a desperate woman, had become something timeless and beautiful, a beacon of hope and inspiration for all who heard it. And the river that had brought them together continued to flow, season after season, year after year, carrying with it the memory of one spring day when two souls found each other in the midst of danger and chose to face every challenge that followed together, as partners, as lovers, as friends, and ultimately, as one.